Good morning, it's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Wonderful to have you with us today. I hope your day is getting off to a strong start. Later this hour on Air Talk, we'll be taking a look at long-term marriages that break up. I want to hear from you if you were in a long-term marriage that came to an end, about that process, and not just what it was like for you, but for your adult kids. And if you are an adult kid of a long-term couple that divorced, that was my circumstance. My parents divorced just as I was graduating college. I would be very interested in hearing from you about your experience and what that was like. This in light of Bill and Melinda Gates' 27-year marriage coming to an end. They have 3 adult kids, ages 18 to 25. And so I'm sure a lot of their friends and family members thinking about the adult kids as well as about the Gateses themselves divorcing after all these years. That's coming up later this hour. But we begin with the very latest on COVID-19. Joining us is Dr. Annabelle de St. Maurice, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and Co-Chief of Infection Prevention at UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital. Dr. de St. Maurice, thank you for joining us again on Air Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today, Los Angeles County, alone among Southern California counties, moves into the least restrictive tier of restrictions, if that's not redundant, the yellow tier. First of all, your thoughts about this and the increasing capacities in most public areas.
I think this is really great news. It shows that we've been able to bring the positivity rates down to less than 1%. Currently, we have fewer than 1.6 new cases for every 100,000 people in Los Angeles County. So this is really great news that we've been able to make this progress. I think as far as increasing capacity, if we do it thoughtfully and if individuals continue to follow public health guidance for masking when they're in crowds, I think that this can be done safely, particularly now that vaccines are increasing.
I'd love to hear from listeners if there's something that is more accessible now for you under the yellow tier. I'd love to hear from you what you're planning to do that's now allowed, that wasn't before, that you've been looking forward to as capacity increases. We're at 866-893-KPCC, the Air Talk page, kpcc.org, tweet at Air Talk, or post on our Facebook page. Amusement parks, fairs, theme parks can increase their capacity up now to 35%, and out-of-state visitors are now permitted at California venues like that if the out-of-state visitors have been fully vaccinated. Full vaccination is not required for locals, but for people from out of state. For bars that do not provide meals, they can now operate indoors at 25% capacity or 100 people, whichever is fewer. Masking is always required except when you are actually in the act of eating or drinking, and you can only eat or drink while seated. So you can't be, walking around drinking in a bar environment. Tables also have to be at least 6 feet apart, and there is no counter seating or service. So you can't sit at the bar and have your drink. There's some other restrictions as well. For restaurants, they can increase capacity for indoor dining to 50%. Still has to be 6-foot distancing between tables, which may make it difficult for many restaurants to be able to comply with up to 50%. A maximum of 6 people from one household per table. If everyone is vaccinated, 6 people can sit together from up to 6 different households. But, the challenge is, are restaurants realistically going to be monitoring that, Dr. de St. Maurice?
I think it's going to be a challenge. I think that most of us probably do not walk around with our vaccine card in our back pocket. So it is going to be a challenge for restaurants to ask individuals if there are 6 people sitting at a table, are you from the same household? Are you fully vaccinated? But I think this does provide guidance as people are going out about what public health considers safe and what is high or low risk.
Some people I know have taken a photo of their vaccination card. I did that, so it's on my phone if anyone were to ask. I'm just trying to imagine a restaurant actually asking me to show that. I'd love to hear from restaurateurs or restaurant managers. Is this something you're contemplating with increased capacity at your restaurant? 866-893-KPECC or the AirTalk page, kpecc.org. Movie theaters can operate at 50% capacity in LA County now. Reserved seating only, where each group is seated with at least 6 feet of distance between any other groups. Capacity limited to ensure there is at least 6 feet of distance between the groups. Seating sections can be established for fully vaccinated theatergoers without the 6-foot distancing requirements, provided there's 3 feet of distance between these sections and other seats in the theater. This all makes sense, Dr. D. St. Maurice. I'm not laughing that it's not a rational approach. There's justification. I'm just trying to picture the venues figuring this all out with the almost infinite permutations of groups of customers.
Right. I think it will be challenging. And as you know, there's so many permutations. And if you think about vaccinated versus unvaccinated and indoor versus outdoor, it becomes challenging for people to really implement it. But again, it makes sense, and it's all intended to really allow us to start going back to normal, but without increasing the risk. And these guidelines are not easy to create because they require an understanding of the science, but also trying to make it as practical and able to be implemented as possible. But I do realize it gets confusing and hard to implement at times.
Grocery and retail stores now can allow up to 75% of their posted capacity. There is still a 6-foot distancing requirement between customers. I'm not seeing on this masking required, but I think that goes without saying that masks are required indoors at shops and at grocery stores. Hair salons, barbershops, personal care services can now operate at 75%. Masks required except for services where customers need to have their masks removed. I guess if you're having a beard trimmed or something like that. And for services where customers do have to remove face coverings, staff has to wear a fitted N95 mask or a face covering with a face shield in addition. Museums, zoos, aquariums, 75% capacity with the safety modifications remaining in place. And for sports venues, live performance, here's where it gets really dicey because you can do 25% of capacity for indoor venues, but if everybody is vaccinated, you can go up to 50%. But Dr. D. St. Maurice, you've still got this 6-foot distancing thing, which I understand for Dodger Stadium, for example, they're not looking, at least immediately, to sell more tickets to games because even though they're not close to that higher capacity allowance, they can't create the distance necessary to make that work. So that's going to keep our sporting events still with small crowds.
Right. I think they do have a section for fully vaccinated individuals.
Yes.
If you are fully vaccinated and have an entire section, then that does reduce the physical distancing requirement for these outdoor events.
And I know the Dodgers did that, I think, for a Padre game weekend before last, and they're looking at expanding the size of those full vaccination segments where you still have to be masked during the game, but you don't have to observe the distancing as occurs in the rest of the park. We're at 866-893-KPECC. It's your chance to weigh in on the less restrictive yellow tier. It would appear likely that other Southern California counties are poised to enter that tier in the coming few weeks. 866-893-KPECC. The AirTalk page, kpecc.org. You can tweet at AirTalk or post on the AirTalk Facebook page. Let's see. Ralph wondering what safeguards are or will be in place to ensure vaccination compliance by servers and employees, both in front and the back of the house. I think that this is a real challenge because businesses at this point, without full FDA approval for the vaccines, understandably, have concerns about mandating this for employees. Dr. De St. Maurice, your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is a challenge, just as you pointed out, to require or mandate vaccines since they are under emergency use authorization. I think employers can certainly try to provide incentives for their employees to get vaccinated, things like time off in order to get the vaccine, or allowing some flexibility to the schedule so that if they do have side effects, like fever or muscle aches after they get vaccinated, that they can take the day off. But I agree, it does become challenging to mandate it. The biggest risk, though, is from customers to the server in most settings, and for the servers and other employees to themselves, since most of the time when the servers are coming to wait on a table, they are required to wear a face shield and a mask or face covering. So I think they're probably, at greatest risk when they're interacting with each other and when they're interacting with a customer, but are less likely to kind of transmit to the person who's sitting at the table.
I'd asked Air Talk listeners, with the relaxed COVID restrictions for LA County, what you're most looking forward to doing under those new protocols. Steve tweets, first outdoor concert in over a year, Glass Animals at Hollywood Forever in September, sold out in 3 minutes. Demand for live music seems stronger than ever. Will large indoor concerts come back before 2022? Steve, that's a great question. Dr. De St. Maurice, do you think that large indoor concerts have a chance this year?
I think they potentially do, depending on vaccine status. I could see them requiring vaccination to attend an indoor concert or documentation of a negative test. But I think there's a potential. I don't know what large is, right? Does that mean 50 to 100 people or more than that? But I think there's a potential for it over the summer if we continue to see decreases in rates and increases in vaccines.
866-893-KPCC. JP writes on the page, Larry, you may not be laughing at the new applicable regs, but anti-maskers are. The unwieldy nature of regs feeds and fosters cynicism, and we have a pandemic of that too. Let's see. We have Joaquin wants to weigh in on the issue of the Biden administration now pushing to remove the patent protections on the vaccines that have been developed by pharmaceutical companies. Joaquin writes, we've spent several $1 trillion on stimulus, and we're still planning to do more. Meanwhile, these drug companies created miracle vaccines within days of sequencing the virus. But we're going to take away their patent protection instead of paying them $20 billion or so. Penny wise and pound foolish. Give the drug companies their patent protection record profits. They've earned it. And it's only a rounding error in the next stimulus proposal. That's Joaquin writing on the Air Talk page. Dr. Annabelle De St. Maurice, UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital. Your thoughts on the patent protection issue? This, of course, is aimed at getting more vaccine into more developing countries.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated issue, as the listener points out. I do think we have to ensure vaccine equity to get out of this global pandemic. We know that certain countries are not getting as much vaccine as others. We've seen what's happened in India, and I think this is really, really problematic, both from a U.S. perspective, because if we have travelers coming from these countries that are unvaccinated, that's a problem. But also just globally and morally speaking, we need to make sure that we can help these other countries. I'm not sure that this patent removal will solve that problem. We still have manufacturing and supply chain issues. But I do think it's potentially a step in the right direction, although, as the listener points out, it does have some negative consequences, particularly for these companies.
Linda in Huntington Beach says, I see signs on quite a few elevators saying only one person allowed at a time for COVID-19 prevention. I'm wondering, how long should we wait to enter an elevator after a person has been in it? So funny you mentioned elevators, Linda. Yesterday, afternoon, I went to a dermatology appointment, and so I was waiting to get on the elevator, and there were three other people. The elevator door opens, and it has the little circles on the floor to show where you're supposed to stand in the elevator, and it showed three people spread out. So I motion, for the person next to me, go ahead, be the third person, I'll wait. And then they look at me and gesture that people come on in. So, okay. So I got in the elevator. There were four of us. And I said, by the way, I'm fully vaccinated. And they all said, well, I am too. Yeah, it's funny, but it's like negotiating this whole process of what you're going to do in a public space like that. And Dr. D. St. Maurice, I was just wondering, at the hospital, is this something that you see people negotiating the elevators?
Yeah, we typically have those same circles in our hospital and have recommend about four people in the elevator in the four corners. But to be honest, the risk of transmission in a brief elevator ride is pretty low. I mean, everyone's wearing a mask because you're indoors, and the interaction between others is really minimal. You're not in there for very long, hopefully, unless the elevator gets stuck, but that's a different problem. So I think it's really low risk.
So, Linda, Huntington Beach, don't worry. You can ride the elevator. Just get in after the other person gets out. You'll be wearing your mask anyway. We'll continue with UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital Assistant Professor of Pediatrics, Annabelle D. St. Maurice. We'll hear what Dr. D. St. Maurice has to say about Pfizer apparently looking in the fall for the full approval of its mRNA vaccine, and also about a conditional approval, emergency authorization for use of its vaccine in kids 2 to 11 years old. We'll talk about that when we come back in just 1 minute.
This podcast is supported by the Hammer Museum at UCLA, exploring today's most pressing cultural and political questions. Visit the Hammer's website to find hundreds of exhibitions, talks, interviews, and live events with today's leading artists, thinkers, and filmmakers. More at hammer.ucla.edu.
Coming up on Air Talk, in light of the divorce announced by Bill and Melinda Gates after 27 years of marriage, we'll talk with listeners who had long-term, 2-decade-plus marriages, what that was like, and the reaction of family, friends, and adult children who go through what is a very stressful and often traumatic experience. We think of what the price is on kids with a divorce of their parents, but even with adults. I have to speak for myself, as my parents split just after I graduated from college, and it's tough even for an adult kid when you see your parents going through that. I'd be interested to hear from listeners what that was like for you on either side of that very difficult experience. Right now, we're talking with Dr. Annabelle D. St. Maurice, UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital, where Dr. D. St. Maurice is Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and Co-Chief of Infection Prevention for Mattel Children's Hospital. We're at 866-893-KPCC, 866-893-5722, the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. And again, I'd really like to hear from you. With these relaxed yellow tier restrictions in LA County, what are you hoping to do that before wasn't accessible to you? With 50% at the gym, for example, capacity, even though you still have to be masked indoor at the gym, are you looking to go back now? Is that going to make it more feasible for you to do your workout at the gym? 866-893-KPCC. Beatrice in the Mount Washington district said, I heard this morning that people were getting busted for fake vaccination cards. Do we know if that has any effect on people with real vaccination cards with reopened businesses? This has always been a concern because obviously it wouldn't take much to come up with your own forged vaccination record card, unfortunately. Dr. D. St. Maurice, any thoughts on how to deal with that?
I think it is a challenge. I don't have any, great ideas on how we're going to enforce that, particularly as you mentioned, a lot of people do take a picture of their vaccine card and may not actually have the card on hand. So I think it is going to be a challenge, and I think there may be some creative ways that the U.S. government and health and local health departments kind of come up with a way to make sure that we have validated vaccine cards. But for the time being, I think it's just going to have to be a challenge.
Let's talk about Pfizer, where the New York Times is reporting that the FDA is expected to be petitioned by Pfizer to give full approval for its vaccine. Also, Pfizer looking to have the vaccine administered under emergency use for kids 2 to 11 years old. From what you've been able to follow, Dr. de St. Maurice, do you think that's a realistic timeline? And if so, what effect might that have on schools fully reopening campuses?
Yeah, I think, we still haven't had the full the emergency use authorization for children 12 to 16 years of age for the Pfizer yet. We're still awaiting that. We expect to have that sometime soon next week. But I think it may be a realistic goal for Pfizer to have all of that by the fall. And I think it would lead to more confidence as family members are sending their children back to school, and I think it would be great to kind of help protect children and protect their family members from getting COVID from the kids.
Chris in Palm Springs says, I think people who are fully vaccinated should be allowed to go maskless inside public spaces since they're less likely to transmit the virus. It would also be an incentive for everyone to get vaccinated. Chris, it would be a huge incentive, but I think the challenge is what we're talking about earlier, to really verify that someone was fully vaccinated. Taking someone's word for that is, I think, a difficult thing because a certain percentage of the public won't be truthful about that. I mean, I guess if you were able to have some sort of an antibody test or something as the terms of entry, that might work, Dr. de St. Maurice, but that's not practical.
Right, it's not practical. And even though the vaccine is very effective, we know that indoors the risk of transmission is higher. So I think for the time being, as we're still seeing cases in LA, it's still not zero, and we're seeing a lot of cases abroad. It still makes sense to require masks indoors, but we're trying to make things, a little bit easier for those who are vaccinated, knowing that the risks of transmission among that population is a lot lower. 866-893-KPCC. Moderna announcing that its COVID-19 vaccine is 96% effective in teenagers 12 to 17 years old. This, the company self-reporting of its phase 2 clinical trials. And that, of course, is going to have to be, peer reviewed. Any sense, Doctor, about how long before we might see Moderna's vaccine in that younger teen group? I'm hoping it'll also be sometime this summer. That would also be great because then we have 2 vaccines that can be given to adolescents. But we still, as you mentioned, need to see the peer-reviewed data, and they need to submit it to the FDA, which they still haven't done. But the reassuring thing is they didn't see any serious side effects, and it sounds as though they're going to continue to collect data before submitting their emergency use amendment.
Also, Moderna announcing that their vaccine is showing effectiveness against the variants that we have been most concerned about. One of them, the UK, which has become so present here in the United States. Given what they're reporting, do you think that we are going to need a booster later in the year, or do you think we may well get enough coverage of these strains with the current vaccines?
I think for the time being, most infectious disease specialists kind of think that the booster is something we should work on developing, but probably won't necessarily need this fall. But I think it's still good to have this additional tool just in case we do see a resurgence. It did demonstrate safety and efficacy, so I think that's really great news, and it's a good thing to have on hand. And in some areas where they're still seeing a lot of transmission, it may be a really important tool to help stop the spread of some of these variants.
Roberta in Redondo Beach says, we've been invited to an outdoor wedding of over 100 people where everyone has to be fully vaccinated to attend. I'm a cancer patient. It's suggested in the invitation that people won't wear masks, but should I, as a cancer patient, wear a mask?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on, what type of chemotherapy you're having and how recent your cancer diagnosis was. So I would definitely talk with your physician before deciding whether or not to attend the event. But personally, if I were, somebody who maybe might have reduced response to the vaccine, if I had a challenge with my immune system, I would continue to wear a mask in those types of settings, realizing that the risk of transmission probably is low since it's outdoors and everyone's fully vaccinated.
We have a question from, I just lost her question. Alice in Long Beach. With Dodger Stadium still requiring you to wear a mask even if you're vaccinated, why is that? It would seem like that's a deterrent to get vaccinated if you're still going to have to wear a mask in an outdoor space like that.
I think they're doing it because, as the prior person who called in had mentioned, some people who get the vaccine may not respond as well as others to the vaccine. So if you're in close, crowded areas, it still makes sense to wear a mask just to make sure that those who may not have had as good of a response are still protected. As we see the rates go down a lot more in LA, then maybe some of those regulations can change.
Do we know with the kids who were part of the clinical trial, the under 12s who were being tested, are there side effects, do we know yet, similar to what adults have gone through? Are we seeing any differences in type of side effect or intensity of effect?
So far, it seems like the safety profiles are very similar, which is really reassuring.
All right. April in South Los Angeles says so many businesses have closed. COVID has changed the landscape of this city so much. I've been looking forward to going back to ArcLight. Seemed accessible enough. Now I'll need to dream a new post-COVID dream. That's April in South Los Angeles. You can share your comments on the Air Talk page, kpcc.org, throughout the day as the conversation continues. Dr. Annabelle D. St. Maurice, UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital, professor at UCLA Mattel, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. We'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's Air Talk on 89.3 KPCC, and as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the news came seemingly out of the blue that Bill and Melinda Gates, after 27 years of marriage, were ending their marriage. They have 3 grown kids, ages 25 to 18. And we thought it would be good to talk a bit about this experience of later in life divorce and divorce after 2 decades or more of marriage, and what the effect is not just on the couple, but on grown kids. So much of the emphasis in divorce is rightfully placed on what does this mean for children when their parents split, and that is important. But there also, I think, can be a significant effect on adult children. I use myself as an example. When my parents split after 20-plus years of marriage, I just graduated college, and it hit hard, no question about it. I don't think it would have been the intensity had I been a little kid. I certainly understood the reasons for it. I wasn't upset as though they were making the wrong decision, but it's still very, very difficult to go through, and when you think of your parents as that unit, to have them split. So I'd like to hear from you, if you're someone who's gone through a long-term marriage and then gone through a divorce, hear how that affected you very briefly, how it affected your adult kids, and if you are an adult child of parents who were in a long-term marriage who then divorced when you reached adulthood, I'd like to hear what the toughest part of that was for you and what helped you be able to process that. 866-893-KPECC, 866-893-5722, or the AirTalk page, kpecc.org. With me is Laguna Hills-based licensed marriage and family therapist and collaborative divorce coach, Carol Hughes. She's co-author of Home Will Never Be the Same Again, a guide for adult children of gray divorce. Perfectly on point for our conversation. Carol Hughes, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's start first of all with what are some of the things that are a bit different about divorce for couples who have been together so long?
Well, some of the factors that we know from the research that contributes to divorce in this population, what's called the gray divorce population, ages 50 and older, are that we know that people are living longer than we did in previous generations. And when they become empty nesters, that is, the children leave home, pursue college, careers, and so forth, they may still have decades of life ahead of them. And couples who may have tolerated each other when the children were still at home now just can't even imagine staying married to the person they married decades ago and with whom it feels they have nothing in common. Economics is a factor, too. We know that most American women have jobs and careers outside the home, so they're not economically as dependent on their husbands or partners as was decades ago. And they feel that they have a choice now whether to stay with a husband that maybe they don't like or love anymore or not. And then the values about marriage we know have changed. For example, in 2001, research indicated that about 45% of Americans considered divorce morally acceptable, and in 2014, 69% did. So it seems that we're not so focused on till death do us part. And in the baby boomer and older generations, we're seeing this trend grow exponentially.
We're talking with marriage and family therapist, collaborative divorce coach, and neutral child specialist Carol Hughes, co-author of Home Will Never Be the Same Again. Jennifer Gates is the oldest daughter of Bill and Melinda Gates. She's 25 years old, and she shared on her Instagram story this post addressed to her friends. By now, many of you have heard the news that my parents are separating. It's been a challenging stretch of time for our whole family. I'm still learning how to best support my own process and emotions, as well as family members at this time, and I'm grateful for the space to do so. I won't personally comment further on anything around the separation, but please know that your kind words and support mean the world to me. She also thanked readers of her Instagram story for understanding her family's desire for privacy at this time. We're talking about what it's like for an adult child of a couple who split after many years together and what it's like for the couple themselves. We're at 866-893-KPECC or the AirTalk page, kpecc.org. Paul in Riverside says, I got divorced later in life and I'm also a child of divorce. There's only good things that come from divorce in the end, an end to the fighting and conflict. That's Paul in Riverside. Inga writes on the page, I divorced after almost 39 years. The children were in their early 30s, and I'm sure it made it a lot easier than a divorce when the children are younger. We did all stay friends after the divorce. This makes it sound all cute and easy, but it was not. Just the time leading up to actually making the decision was worse. That's Inga, posting on our AirTalk page. We'll continue in just 90 seconds on AirTalk. On Air Talk today, we're talking about long-term marriages that break up, what that's like for the couple, and what it's like for the adult kids of the couple that's divorcing. Sandra in Culver City joining us. She's been married over 40 years. And Sandra, I understand you're going through a divorce from your husband right now?
Well, we're not going through it. We're still living together, but we will be soon. But I can't even believe you're talking about this, because today was a real turning point, and we've lived together knowing that we were going to separate for a while, but because of money, it's been really hard. He lent our life savings to somebody and hasn't gotten it back. And so it makes it very hard for me to start a new life and move out.
And I understand you have a 19-year-old daughter?
Yes, and a 19-year-old adopted daughter who we haven't sat down and told her, but I'm sure she can see the lack of love in the house. Yeah.
Sandra, you want to hang on because our guest, Carol Hughes, licensed marriage and family therapist, what advice do you have for Sandra as she goes through this? My understanding is that she's not spoken to her daughter yet about the impending divorce.
Well, since we aren't in a therapeutic relationship, Sandra and I'm going to give general information, and there's a lot of good information, Sandra, in the book that my co-author, Bruce Fredenberg, and I wrote that was already mentioned on the show. Number one, we want you to realize that, and we write about it, that the divorce does affect adult children, as Jennifer Gates was saying, how hard it is to balance her own feelings with, wanting to support the parents. And I would encourage you to eventually, you and your husband sit down and talk with each other and share with her what you want her to know. And what we know from research is that the best option for the children, adult children as well, is if the parents can remain friendly and continue to do some family activities like, dinner once a month or celebrations still together, birthdays, Mother's Day, Father's Day that's coming up, so that the children don't lose that sense of family, even though their mother and father aren't in a married relationship anymore, because parents are always their children's parents.
Sandra, we wish you all the best as you go through this very, very difficult time with your husband and with your daughter. So we'll be thinking about you, and thank you for calling. That's Sandra in Culver City. We're at 866-893-KPECC. Josh in Placentia, you had experience for this as you were heading off to college. You got the news?
Yeah, it was life-changing, honestly. It felt like my whole childhood was fake, and it was hard for me to process it, and it also affected my freshman year and my sophomore year. Lots of therapy. We're at a good place now, but man, it was hard. I'm 29 now, so it took a while to get to this point.
Yeah, and so speak to that a little bit more, if you would, sort of how it undermined your sense of your childhood.
Yeah, it made it feel like the memories we made, all the vacations we had, it made me think, was there underlying fighting during that time? Was it all just they tried to cover it up while we were growing up, my brother and I? And it was definitely difficult.
Oh, Josh, but it sounds like, as you said, therapy and working through this in a better place. What's your relationship like, just real briefly, with your parents now?
Yeah, so my mom and I, we're really close. She lives in Glendale. There was a period of time where we didn't talk for about a year, and that was my sophomore year of college. My dad, he actually moved off, and he lives in Ohio now. We're working through stuff. We're still close, but the way that the divorce happened, both my brother and I, we kind of took two separate sides, and that wasn't a good thing.
That's tough.
But we worked through that, and so we're close now, as much as we can be at this point.
That's tough, Josh. I'm glad you raised that issue, though, because I'd like to hear the thoughts of Carol Hughes about where you've got the adult kids who lean more toward one parent's perspective than another, and how divisive that can be.
Yes, and Josh, I want to tell you I feel your pain, and you're 29 now. You weren't alone even going off to college. You didn't know, but what you were feeling then was exactly what many, many adult children of gray divorce feel. You mentioned wondering if your whole childhood had been fake. That's a very common statement that adult children make in this situation, and that you and your brothers pick sides. That's another common situation that happens, and being estranged. You know, you were estranged from your mom for about a year, and sounds like you and your dad are trying to work through things still. So sadly, it is very common that the adult children pick sides. It's kind of how our brain is wired, is to categorize things, good and bad, right and wrong, safe, unsafe. And so it's human nature to do that. But it does definitely stress all the relationships in the family and extended family and community members. And it doesn't have to be that way. If parents can create what we call a divorce story, which is how you hope that you want your friends, family members, community members, etc., to handle the separation and divorce and not have battle lines drawn. That's really important if parents can do that. And it gives everybody the freedom to support both parents during this difficult time and the adult children.
Bailey writes on our Air Talk Facebook page, "My husband and I were married 38 years when I filed for divorce. It was a relief as we'd separated 3 times and reunited to no avail. Our adult kids were in their 40s. After the divorce, they saw just how difficult their father was to deal with, not having me there as a buffer. They had no idea his real personality until then. They understood my travails. We all get along well now." That's Bailey writing on Facebook. Let's take another call from, let's see, Ambu in Newport Beach.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. So share with us, because your parents had a little bit of a different story with a divorce when you were little, and then they got back together?
Yeah. Mine is a unique story. I was 10 years old. My parents got divorced. And I think I felt relief at that time because they had such an abusive relationship that I felt like, one of them is gone. So at least my childhood was somewhat, there was a normalcy there. And then they got back together when I was an adult, and I remember I felt good, as if my family structure was back again. My parents were back together, and it was surprising because I was an adult. I was in my 40s at that time, and I still felt like a child that they were back, and I was happy. And then again, they separated, and I distinctly remember when they told me, my father especially, that he wanted to live away from my mother. I howled in my 40s like a child. I felt like the earth had been shaken. And it doesn't matter how old you are, because your parents have such a, strong structure, so much support structure in your life that no matter, how old you are, you feel the impact. I just felt like I went through a double divorce with my parents, as a child and then again as an adult. And it has repercussions in my own life. I can see that I have issues with fear and security and, relationships.
Yeah, Ambu, thank you for sharing this. So even, what are you now, like 10 years after the second divorce, you still feel the effects of this?
I do, and they are back together again.
Oh, they are? Oh, my goodness. Wow.
They still have a disruptive relationship, and I'm still acting as the buffer. And it's very, very difficult. It is not easy. And, it has a psychological impact on me, a severe price I have paid for it.
Ambu, thank you for sharing your experiences, and you've given us some really important things to talk about when we continue. So we're gonna come back to our guest, Carol Hughes, licensed marriage and family therapist, collaborative divorce coach, neutral child specialist, and mediator. She's based in Laguna Hills and co-author of Home Will Never Be the Same Again, a guide for adult children of gray divorce. Ambu in Newport Beach has given us some things to talk about. We'll be back in just 1 minute on Air Talk. It's Air Talk on KPCC. I'm Larry Mantle with licensed marriage family therapist Carol Hughes. In light of the split after 27 years of marriage by Bill and Melinda Gates, we're talking about some of the factors that go into what's called gray divorce, and also the effect on the adult kids of those who've been married so long, who are thought of very much as a couple and unit. Even if there's discord in a marriage like that, one still tends to think many of those as a couple, and then how disorienting and emotionally difficult it can be to have one's parents divorce, even when you're grown. Ambu in Newport Beach talked about a case where her parents divorced, went back together and remarried. They split again. Now we're back together for a third time. And the uncertainty of all that, I would think, Carol Hughes, would be one of the really difficult things about that. And Ambu talked about the effect on her own sense of security from that.
Yes, and from the adult children that we've been hearing from on the show today, it really echoes what my co-author Bruce Fredenberg and I had heard over the years working with these adult children, and what the little bit of research there is quotes these adult children as saying things like, "It shook me to my foundation. I just started sobbing out of nowhere. I don't know why. Then I remember my family's gone. My family's dead. After so many years of marriage, why now? And was our whole family life smoke and mirrors or a fake, as Josh said? Am I going to be like my parents? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Am I good relationship material?" Adult children who are married start questioning if they're going to be able to maintain their marriage or split like their parents did. So a lot of uncertainty comes with this. And the family unit for holidays and get-togethers and all those celebratory situations is dissolving as well. So it does create a lot of instability.
All right, Ambu, thank you for your call. Let's talk with Eric in Hollywood. Eric, share with us, please, your experience with your parents' split.
Sure. So when I was, I guess, my mid-20s, I got a letter from my parents saying, so you probably noticed that we've gone apart and we're going to get a split. It's amicable. And I hadn't noticed anything. I didn't notice anything at all. It was this assumption they were making. And then because of this, I never really found out why. I was, in the beginning, made to believe it was my mother. And then it turned out just recently, my brother said he had a conversation with my mother saying at the time, is he going to leave me? Is he going to leave me? I'm really scared. So all this not knowing, and then my mother's passed away and my father's in his 90s. I'll never get an answer to that.
Yeah. Eric, thank you. Appreciate your call. 866-893-KPCC. Carol Hughes, just briefly, for those who didn't see it coming, who everything seemed fine with their parents, is that even more difficult than if kids are aware of the tension or incompatibility?
Definitely, because there's shock. As Eric was just saying, he didn't see it coming. He had no idea, but the parents assumed he did. And what ensues very quickly after the shock is grieving. And I'm sorry to hear your situation, Eric, that you never got to really talk with your mom about it, and that exacerbates the grieving that you're feeling for having lost her on this earth, but also not able to talk with her about it. So shock and grieving are a big part of the reactions when the adult children didn't even suspect this was going to happen.
Let's talk with Rye in Riverside. Rye, you're on Air Talk. What age were you at when your parents split?
Ray.
Ray, I'm sorry.
Hi. Yeah, so I was actually about to go to college. So like one of your previous callers, and my parents had been married for almost 30 years when they divorced. I'm the youngest by several years, so my older siblings were already out the house. And I think that they thought that it would be better for all of us to grow up in a two-parent household, which is why they waited. But to be honest, it had been such a toxic marriage. I spent my childhood wondering why they hadn't split up earlier. And it's been almost 20 years, not quite since then. And truthfully, our family was better for them splitting up because they still came to milestones and events with all the kids. They came to my graduations and, our weddings and kids' births and all that kind of stuff. And, we were all much more happy because they were more civil towards each other once they were out of the same household. So it was actually kind of positive for us.
Yeah. Rai, thank you so much. Ray, I'm sorry, pardon me, misprint in the with your name. I'm so sorry. Ray joining us from Riverside. We're at 866-893-KPECC. Let's talk next with, in Marina Del Rey, Alexandria. Alexandria, how old were you when your parents divorced?
Hi, yeah. So my parents were they had been married for 30 years, and I was 21, and a lot like Ray. At first I would say that I avoided it, meaning the result of us having to get rid of the family home, that was probably the biggest part of it for me. And I just didn't want to face that because I loved the house that I was raised in. But I was well already out of the house and sort of establishing my own career. And so the actual divorce itself, a lot like Ray, was very amicable and very it just opened me up to what is possible and recognizing, now 20 plus years later as a mom and a partner myself, my parents are very good friends.
That's nice.
We're very close near each other. My mom has since remarried. My dad has been with his new partner since 17 years now. And we celebrate all the holidays, or as many as we can together, graduations and birthdays. And
Alexandria, that's great. I'm so sorry that we're coming up against the end of the hour, but it's so nice that as difficult as it was early on, that it's become so amicable. I'm so glad in my case that my parents get along. And in fact, next week when I'm on vacation, I'm taking my mom on a road trip, and one of the stops we're making is at my dad's place up in Northern California. So the three of us will be together again, first time in many years, which will be really nice. I'm looking forward to being with my two parents together next week on that trip. All right, we have much more to come in the second hour, but first I want to thank licensed marriage and family therapist Carol Hughes, co-author of Home Will Never Be the Same Again. Tell you what's coming in a moment. Good morning. It's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Wonderful to have you with us. The Los Angeles Angels baseball team has just announced it's designating Albert Pujols for assignment, the future certain Hall of Famer who in the last few years had a very difficult time with consistent performances and has dealt with injuries. He's in the final year of his long-term contract with the Angels. The Angels announced they have designated Albert Pujols for assignment to clear a roster spot. He also has a personal services contract with the Angels that extends past the time of his playing years with the team. We turn our attention now to an initiative that was announced a couple of years ago by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. The Office of the Mayor formed a panel of 40 scholars, historians, architects, and other cultural leaders to take a look at the city's relationship with its history, the things it should be celebrating that it isn't, and the very negative experiences in the city's history that maybe have gone covered up or certainly unknown. Last week, the group released a 166-page report with its recommendations. There are many. We'll talk about it over the course of this half hour, but I welcome back to Air Talk UCLA professor of history and Chicano studies, Los Angeles historian and author of The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City, Professor Eric Avila, who was just with us last week to talk about the history of freeway development in Southern California. Professor, very good to have you with us again.
Thank you. Great to be back.
So share with us just sort of generally how the panel undertook this effort to try and figure out a better way to educate Angelenos on the city's history and find ways to commemorate it also.
Well, I think the circumstances of last year in particular, the kind of national spectacle of people tearing down monuments really kind of forced all of us to grapple with legacy of history and the place of history in the landscape of American cities. And here in Los Angeles, we don't really have a clear-cut relationship with the city's history. Los Angeles is not like Paris. It's not like New York or London, Boston, or even San Francisco, in the sense that those cities have a very clear-cut relationship with its past, with their pasts. The monuments to commemorate various events and various leaders of the civic past that kind of drench the landscape of those cities. We don't have that here in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a very young city. And we still have a very kind of vexed and kind of paradoxical relationship with our own history. There's the history that scholars have done over the past 30 years to uncover various tensions, various conflicts in the city's past. But then we also have the romanticized, mythologized, or doctored versions of LA's past. And those mythologies have really served the interests of development or the interests of white settlers who came to Los Angeles in the mid to late 19th century. So we have to kind of clear away the layers of mythology in order to grapple with the history that scholars have uncovered about Los Angeles and trying to figure out the diverse contributions of diverse social groups to the making of modern Los Angeles.
On some of the differences with other major cities that you've discussed, I wonder if part of it is the fact that this was a comparatively late growing city. I'm in a fairly small group of 4-generation Angelenos. My great-grandfather came here from Michigan at the turn of the 20th century. But for most people, there are much later arrivals, whether from immigration outside the country or from migration within the United States. And so, this has been a city that I think has been much more looking at what's coming than referencing what was in the past, because most people don't feel a familial connection with that as you might have with many more New Yorkers or even Chicagoans. Is that part of the factor here?
Yes, I think that's definitely part of the factor. And one of the things that many of us share in Los Angeles, not necessarily my case, my family goes back 5 or 6 generations in the Inland Empire.
Wow.
But many people share a sense of, moving away and moving towards something new. And LA has represented the future for many groups of people who have made Los Angeles their home. And in some ways, these groups have been able to kind of assert a sense of place, a sense of identity in the landscape in ways that are not necessarily possible in other cities because the histories are structured and the groups are structured. Nonetheless, here in Los Angeles, the way that the past has been remembered and the way that it has been forgotten, the way that it has been mythologized, has always worked to favor some groups over other groups. And I think the intent behind this report and the work that we've done is to try to figure out more equitable ways of remembering the past that bring in, more diverse perspectives and helping people to understand across identity, across community, to get a sense of what other people contributed to the making of modern Los Angeles.
Professor, it also seems to me that it's not talked about very much what a multiracial city Los Angeles was earlier on, and we're going to talk about some of the examples of racial hatred and violence, but there were also examples of multi-ethnic people living together when that was much rarer other parts of the country. It seems, that's part of the story that also hasn't been as told.
That's absolutely right. I mean, to me, I think of communities like Boyle Heights or Watts in the early 20th century. Those were multiracial, multi-ethnic working class communities. And I think that's something to celebrate, the way that, people came together and learned to live together, to forge a community together, despite their many differences and different backgrounds. However, it is important to remember that the multiculturalism or multiracial character of those communities was structured by very strict patterns of racial exclusion throughout other parts of the city. So one of the reasons why Boyle Heights was so diverse was because these racial and ethnic groups were not able to settle in other suburban neighborhoods that were reserved for whites only through formal and informal practices.
So you got concentrations like in South Los Angeles of African Americans because of those limits, but it also created multi-ethnic neighborhoods. It's fascinating that it had that dual effect of ethnic and racial concentration and diversification.
Right, yes, but it changed. It changed. Now, by the mid-20th century, Watts became recognized as a ghetto, a concentration of Black poverty. Boyle Heights similarly became recognized as a barrio, a concentration of Mexican American working class people. But that did not reflect the multiracial, multi-ethnic origins of those communities. But, again, we see change over time. And I think that's part of the changes that we want to remember in our efforts to rebuild a civic memory for Los Angeles.
We're talking with UCLA Professor of History and Chicano Studies, Eric Avila. The Los Angeles historian is author of The Folklore of the Freeway. Also with us is the Executive Director of the Armory Center for the Arts, Leslie Ito. Leslie, thank you very much for joining us. Share with us the important role that artists play particularly in the commemorative process, the artistic depictions and processing of these important historic events.
Thanks for having me, Larry, and for the great question. I think artists play an incredible role in helping the city both remember but also imagine change and where our city, where we imagine our city to be and how we embrace those histories. So we're organized into working groups, and the working group that I served on was about process. We were led by Rostin Wu, who is an artist himself and currently a Stanton Fellow with the Durfee Foundation, as well as Danielle Brazel, General Manager of the LA Department of Cultural Affairs. And I think their leadership shows that really imagining not just the creation of art, but the creative ways to think about how to commemorate civic memory is really important. Artists play a role in that process, and we're really seeing it across Los Angeles. The LA County Arts, the Department of Arts and Culture, has embedded artists across the county to help problem solve within departments. So I'm really enthusiastic about being able to integrate artists and creative thinkers into the process of moving forward with our city.
Leslie Ito is the Executive Director of the Armory Center for the Arts, which is in Pasadena. And also joining us, like Professor Avila, Ken Bernstein was with us just over a week ago to talk about his new book, Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. He's Principal City Planner for the LA Department of City Planning, overseeing the Office of Historic Resources. Ken, it's good to have you with us again on Air Talks. How does your office fit into this process of a deeper dive into the city's history?
Well, thanks, Larry. It's great to be back with you. Our Office of Historic Resources, in many ways, is engaged with all of these questions on a daily basis about history and memory in Los Angeles, what it is we recognize through historic designations, and therefore are celebrating and helping to preserve and protect in the city. And I think this was a very powerful experience to be part of this group of 40 historians, artists, architects, indigenous leaders, city officials, all coming together to think about these issues about how we engage with history in the city. And to me, one of the most powerful messages and powerful recommendations from the group is that the city should shift its focus in stewarding civic memory and history from its role of acting as a gatekeeper to history to becoming more of a facilitator, really kind of giving fuller voice to bottom-up representation and voices, community memory. And I think that's a very powerful message for us to think about in the way that we structure our historic designation programs. And we've spoken in the past about the fact that we have tremendous disparities in the city about what gets recognized and whose history gets designated and represented in our city programs. And I think the recommendations of the Civic Memory Working Group will really help us in shifting that focus.
When you talk about the recommendation of the city not seeing itself as a gatekeeper, does that mean that more communities or particular groups of interest would have the ability to commemorate or to memorialize certain aspects of the city's history without having to get city approval?
Well, I think that's what we're looking at. I think it's important to realize that the recommendations of the Civic Memory Working Group are meant as a starting point, and this is really beginning to kind of extend and broaden the conversation beyond our single room of the working group itself to begin to have just that conversation around the city as to what that looks like and how we do give fuller voice to community memory. And in part, in terms of being a gatekeeper, it takes time and resources for someone to prepare a nomination of a site to become a city historic cultural monument. We've also had a very ad hoc and reactive process to creating memorials or kind of civic markers around Los Angeles. We have signs that go up around the city designating these squares that are typically named after prominent individuals. So there's a Ray Bradbury Square or a Raymond Chandler Square. Those typically get introduced from the top down. It's a city council member who will introduce a motion to have that happen and have a sign posted. And the working group is really recommending a much more inclusive and rigorous approach to begin to ensure that all voices, all communities are represented, and begin to think more comprehensively about who or what should be acknowledged and recognized and preserved in our public space around the city.
All right. We're talking with Ken Bernstein with the City of Los Angeles's Department of City Planning. He oversees the Office of Historic Resources there and is author of the new book, Preserving Los Angeles. Professor Eric Avila, UCLA, Professor of History and Chicano Studies with us. Professor, share with us another one of the recommendations out of, I believe there are 14 that are included here that you think is particularly important.
Well, I would kind of go back to what Ken was saying about trying to be very careful about making sure that this is not a top-down process by which this elite committee anoints certain interpretations of history or certain groups over other groups. And one of the things that came out in the report for me was an emphasis on listening to communities. Listening to voices in terms of, what other people think about what needs to be remembered. An example that we talked about was the Kobe Bryant Memorial that took shape unexpectedly around the Staples Center in 2019. That's an example of, people from the community coming together to create their own kind of memorial. And that process, I think is a really important dynamic that the committee stressed and needs to be remembered going forward about, listening to communities and the sorts of events or processes that are important to communities that generally are not heard in the history of Los Angeles.
We'll continue our conversation with Professor Avila with Leslie Ito, Executive Director of the Army Center for the Arts, to talk about the role of artists in this process of determining what needs to be highlighted, what needs to be part of education, and what needs to be memorialized about Los Angeles' history. And Ken Bernstein oversees the Office of Historic Resources for the City of Los Angeles. We're at 866-893-KPCC. If you'd like to comment or ask a question of our trio of guests, 866-893-5722. We'll continue in just 1 minute. You're listening to Air Talk on KPCC. I'm Larry Mantle, and we're focused on the committee that was put together by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's office, 40 scholars, historians, architects, cultural leaders, to look at LA's relationship with its history. They looked at everything from indigenous land acknowledgement to look at all sorts of different events, ones that are certainly worthy of being honored and brought to public attention, others that are tragic events or violent events from the city's past that perhaps have not been brought to the fore either. If you'd like to talk with our guests, we're at 866-893-KPCC. Delaran writes on the page, regarding whitewashing, one of my pet peeves is that historically, Latinos have been misclassified as white in demographic surveys. So many people, including historians, often quote historic numbers of the LA or Southern California population that totally excludes mention of Latinos. They'll say in 1930, LA was 85% white and 8% black and 5% Asian. And from my own family knowledge and history, I know those numbers to be wrong. I wish there was a way of fixing this, since it serves to exclude Latinos from the story of Los Angeles. And I should ask the fifth-generation Southern Californian, Professor Eric Avila, to comment on that.
No, that's a really good point. Excuse me. Historically, there's been a debate about the racial classification of Latino communities in Los Angeles and in the United States more generally. But the one thing that came to mind in that comment was, I agree with that. However, I think it's important to remember that Los Angeles, in many ways, is kind of the birthplace of Chicano history, the writing of Chicano history. And in the 1970s and late 60s, there was a vibrant community of scholars and historians from Los Angeles, mostly from Los Angeles, who actively worked to create a history, a written history, a scholarly history of Mexican Americans and Chicanos. And they started, an entire subfield of Chicana and Chicano history that has since flourished here in Los Angeles and throughout the United States. So I think it's important to remember that, this is a way that Mexican Americans have inserted their voice into the historical record by creating a record of Mexican American experiences in Los Angeles.
All right, 866-893-KPCC or the Air Talk page, kpecc.org. Professor Eric Avila of UCLA, LA historian, Ken Bernstein, who oversees LA's Office of Historic Resources, part of the City Planning Department, and the Executive Director of Pasadena's Armory Center for the Arts, Leslie Ito. Leslie, what are some of the ways that artists can, coming out of these recommendations, be a part of telling the broader story of Greater Los Angeles?
Well, I think that artists can get involved, and actually not just artists, but I think, community members that are really dedicated to commemorating. I think the overall strategy of all of the recommendations is really to get people involved, that this is not just something that is, in control by the mayor's office, but really how do we get artists and community members, community organizations involved in these efforts across the city. So I think artists can, of course, be involved in erecting monuments and, art pieces to commemorate these histories. But I think the civic engagement is really important. And I want to encourage everybody to visit the website, which is just stunning, the photographs and the oral histories, and in addition to the key recommendations. And from there, this is going to be a hub so that people can connect to public programs, lectures, and other events to continue these efforts, because this is really just the catalyst and the launch of how we're going to move our city forward on civic memory.
All right. Again, we're at 866-893-KPCC or the AirTalk page, kpcc.org. Professor Eric Avila, are there particular incidents in Los Angeles' history that you think are undertold, stories that need more attention?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there are some really big picture aspects of Los Angeles history that need to be remembered and need to be remembered in different ways. But, I think we often gloss over the fact that, Spanish colonization entailed the enslavement of indigenous populations. We gloss over the racial war that the United States waged against Mexico in the middle of the 19th century to claim its land. We gloss over the suppression of Indians and immigrants and the suppression of labor and workers with the staunch open shop policies of early 20th century Los Angeles. All of these aspects of LA history, from different perspectives, those stories have to be told, and how people experienced those processes and events. It's important to remember in their voice and from their experiences. But instead, in the history of Los Angeles, the city has favored mythologies like Olvera Street, for example, or the Spanish-style mission architecture that created this kind of idyllic portrait of Los Angeles that could easily be marketed and sold for development in the region. Or Hollywood, too, which has also been a powerful force in glossing over or concealing these conflict-ridden aspects of LA history.
Adam in Victorville says, I'm Chicano, and on my birth certificate, I'm labeled Caucasian. I was born in 1977 in Victorville. My friends tease me about it, but it's important to appreciate some of the issues with how our history is told. That's Adam in Victorville. Let's see. We have Daniel in Walnut. Daniel, just real quickly, because we're coming to the end of the segment, please share with us the part of LA history you want to highlight.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Daniel Tashuri, and I live in the city of Walnut, which is in Los Angeles County, where the 57 and 60 freeway meet. It's a little hidden gem tucked away. And I'm here to speak about the Brookside Equestrian Center, which is this magical 28 acres piece of property that has a beautiful riparian creek running through it that has found very amazing Native American artifacts as well as petroglyphs. And unfortunately, this land is going to be destroyed. The city council wants to develop 28 homes on it. And it was previously owned by Bullock, J.P. Bullock, who was the owner of the Bullock's department store.
Yeah.
And I'm here to make some noise about the history of it. We're a part of the Brookside Brigade, and we are looking to do our best to save this riparian ecosystem and land and preserve the native Tongva people who have lived in this land for so long before and memorialize their history, as I believe it's a very important part. And just one other fun fact is Elizabeth Taylor's film National Velvet was actually filmed on this land. So if anyone who is listening to this can reach out to us, we're the Brookside Brigade.
Okay.
We're doing the best we can to save this land. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. The Brookside Equestrian Center is what it's known as today. Eric Avila, you familiar with this place?
No, actually, I have not. I have not heard of it, but it sounds like exactly the sort of aspect of LA history that we want to address in the report and this effort.
All right. I want to thank all three of our guests talking about this initiative coming out of the 40-member panel chosen by the mayor's office, the city of Los Angeles, their 166-page report that has come out of their work with a number of major recommendations for how Los Angeles can better highlight the range of its history and making sure stories that weren't told now are able to come to the fore, and that many more voices are represented in that whole process. We have a link to the report titled Past Due, Report and Recommendations of the LA Mayor's Office Civic Memory Working Group, as well as to the website that was mentioned by our guest Leslie Ito of the Armory Center for the Arts as well. Our thanks to Leslie, to Ken Bernstein, and to Professor Eric Avila of UCLA. We have much more to come on Air Talk in just a moment. A recent Associated Press poll shows that 88% of Americans would like to live their later years in their own home as opposed to a long-term care facility. But the challenge is how to pay for home care if someone is going to stay in their home all the way until the end of life. Joining us to talk about that challenge and potential ways either in public policy or public funding to help make that possible is Donna Benton, who's Research Associate Professor of Gerontology at USC and also a Stakeholder Advisory Committee member for the California Master Plan for Aging. Professor Benton, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, I'm always happy to be on the show.
So let's start, first of all, with what this poll showed in the way of Americans supporting some sort of additional public measures to help people live at home. 60% of those who were surveyed support overall a publicly funded, at least in part, publicly funded approach to this. How might that work?
Well, probably this is going to be more likely a public-private partnership. And from a public fund standpoint, we would have to look at how a tax base or some kind of insurance program would be across all ages, so that if you have some type of disability, there would be some funding so that you could pay for in-home care. So I think that's how it would have to work. There are studies that are being done to say what could be the rate and what would be a disabling condition. But this could go across all generations. And in particular, as we get older and we may have less mobility, or because family structure has changed and we have smaller families and fewer people to help care for us, it's going to be important that the insurance allow for flexibility of who we choose to care for us when we do need that help to stay in our home.
Now, my understanding of a private long-term care insurance that's available now is that it's risen dramatically in recent years because the insurance companies they had not factored in that so many people were actually going to be using the insurance, and as a result, the premiums have gone up year by year. This would seem to make it unaffordable for the vast majority of Americans. What place does private long-term care insurance hold right now?
You've said it exactly right, because right now, most people cannot afford the premiums for a long-term care insurance. We usually don't get it until much later in life, and there's no way to have any subsidies. So if we have a way of bringing in some subsidy from public funds, then we might be able to lower those premiums, have a larger base of people who are using the insurance, because we're all living longer. And as we live longer, depending on our health, at some point, maybe past 80, you're going to need some level of help. So right now, you're right. It's absolutely, they're not affordable, and that's why we need to look at public-private partnerships.
We're talking with Donna Benton, Research Associate Professor of Gerontology at the University of Southern California. And also with us again is Dr. Pinchas Cohen, who's Professor of Gerontology, Medicine, and Biological Sciences at the Leonard Davis School of Gerontology at USC, where he's also the Dean of the institution. Dr. Cohen, it's good to have you with us again. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And obviously, this is a very important discussion.
Yeah, let's talk about why it is that 88% of Americans prefer to stay in their own homes as opposed to going into some sort of a congregate living situation. Is this essentially just human nature at play? We like the familiarity and the place that we've been able to make for ourselves.
Without question, transitioning at a late age into an unfamiliar environment without loved ones and a place that you're not comfortable in is nothing any of us would want. And let me say, Larry, that when you talk about public policy related to aging in place, I think the most important thing that's rarely discussed is the fact that Americans have the highest rate of chronic illness during aging and the highest rates of disabilities in the world. And one of our main concerns is that we don't pay enough attention to healthy aging, to the right diet and exercise habits that other countries in the world are leading in. And we need a lot more education and investment in helping people stay healthy, which will eliminate or reduce the need to send so many people to be supported through these chronic care facilities.
Well, and I'm thinking about the huge difference between if individuals late in life are ambulatory or not. We know, for example, that many people with diabetes, because of the complications of that, find themselves unable to walk under their own power. And so, that, of course, is going to require a degree of care that's much higher than someone who's able to get around on his or her own. So elaborate, if you will, on sort of some of these chronic diseases that are overrepresented in this country, how then they figure into the cost of care.
So simply said, Larry, we can save $250 billion a year in the coming decades if we just get everybody to get out and take a walk every day and stop eating fast food and improving the quality of the diet that everybody in the States eat. And literally, it's not just diabetes, it's high blood pressure, it's strokes, and even Alzheimer's disease, which, by the way, is the most costly form of chronic illness in aging, are all result of poor lifestyle. So I can't stress enough how important it is to start this at a young age, or certainly during middle age, so that all of us should pay attention to our health to prevent these chronic diseases.
Dr. Cohen, also, I wonder about the staffing to do this. In an ideal world, you'd have people staying in their homes. There would be funding to be able to pay for care. And even when you have family members, it's debilitating for family members to provide the full-time care for an aging family member. So, even where that's there, to have some sort of outside help able to come in. But realistically, particularly with the baby boomer population bulge, is there any way in the world to come up with enough home health care workers to do this?
Right, Larry. So the key issue is that aging in place requires some sort of caregiving. And that's either done by a spouse, by a child, or by people you hire to come to your home. And there is not just a financial issue, there's a person power issue. And the biggest component to that is lack of training. So what we need, if we want to facilitate aging in place, is to create some sort of a training infrastructure for spouses and children who take care of elderly people. We also need to create a culture of making homes friendly for aging in place that involves, making them safe and preventing falls. A lot of the technology that's being developed now, what people might call smart homes, are specifically developed to help aging in place, to allow people to be safe, to be comfortable, and really to avoid both the alienating and highly costly choice that don't get me wrong, might be necessary for some people to go into chronic care facilities. But we want to reduce the number of people who have to do it.
You mentioned falls, and probably most of us have experience with a fall changing everything for someone who was doing well late in life but took a bad fall, and everything that it took with surgery, recovery, brought about in so many cases a permanent change in quality of life. And I wonder if you can speak to that, because is this one of the biggest areas of education for older people to keep in mind, is fall avoidance?
Fall prevention, fall mitigation, and creating an environment that doesn't facilitate falls is probably the most important and really relatively low-tech thing we can do. And, stairs is where a lot of falls happen. And you can reshape your stairs and add support and prevent slippage. And right there, you can prevent thousands of falls in this state. Falls are, as you said, the biggest factor and event that leads to deterioration. People break hips and never recover. And to prevent falls, it's not just about the home, it's about people learning to be safe. Things like yoga and Tai Chi, as well as just regular exercise and balance exercise, do wonders to delay or prevent falls.
We're talking with Dr. Pinchas Cohen, who's professor of gerontology, medicine, and biological sciences at the Davis School of Gerontology, USC. He's also dean of the School of Gerontology. If you have questions for him or for our guest, USC professor of gerontology, Donna Benton, we're at 866-893-KPCC, 866-893-5722. You can also ask a question or comment on the Air Talk page. You can tweet at Air Talk, or you can post a question on the Air Talk Facebook page, 866-893-KPCC. Omega Man writes on the page, not so black and white. Loneliness kills too. People in their homes need social interaction to survive very long. Professor Donna Benton, you want to comment on that?
And, that's absolutely right. And the COVID pandemic has really pointed out the need to work on social isolation and making sure that we have that social connectedness. In the recent master plan on aging, it's been one of the 4 goals is inclusion, equity, and not isolation as one of the priorities for helping people sustain their life satisfaction as we age. And we want to make sure that people have opportunities to work, to volunteer, and being able to find ways of connecting with people both in person and as we improve technology and access to technology.
Neil writes on the Air Talk page, I'm dubious of expanding government programs. However, a friend tried to get his father's long-term care insurance company to provide the benefits. It would have been easier to perform surgery on himself. He never was able to get payments. My friend finally gave up after his father died, which was the insurance company's business model. That's Neil in the Pico Union District. Professor Benton, do you want to speak to that, about the challenge people get in policies that they have paid years for long-term care, and then the company's denying the claim?
First of all, let me say I'm so sorry to hear that story. It really, hurts our heart, and we know that it's far too common. in with insurance companies, and I think that part of the look at for some regulations that can be done with insurance companies. So while we may want to be, we may not want government to always help us. In some ways, laws can help so that companies can't make delays like this. So I think that, what's good is to take those stories to our elected officials so that they can think of some solutions that are important so that long-term care can work for everyone.
And the state insurance commissioner's office, they oversee long-term care as well, or is that a different part of the state government that reviews those policies? Do you know, Professor Benton?
I wish I could answer that correctly, but I can't.
Yeah, it'd be interesting just to look and see. I'm sure there is regulation of some sort, but it'd be interesting to know where people turn if they have a complaint. We'll try and look that up and see, because Neil raises such an important point with his friend there. We'll continue our conversation with USC's Donna Benton and Dr. Pincus Cohen. And again, your questions or comments about people aging at home, having access to home care, whether it's family or spousally provided or paid care in the home. What are some of the ways that we can help make that able to happen, given the fact that we know 88% of Americans, according to a recent Associated Press poll, want to stay at home all the way through their life and not live in any sort of an institutional care setting. And I'm assuming that even includes assisted living, which some people pay a lot of money to go into an assisted living facility. But it sounds like for most Americans, they want to stay home. And if they need help, have care come in. 866-893-KPCC. We'll be back in a minute. So there are a couple things to know about California and long-term care insurance. It is overseen through the California Department of Insurance. There is also a program from California's Department of Health Care Services, the California Partnership for Long-Term Care, which partners the state of California and participating private insurance companies to help people be able to get long-term care insurance. So there are just a couple things for you to keep in mind there in terms of oversight and ways of getting information about long-term care insurance. But again, it is important to note that it's just not affordable for the overwhelming majority of Californians. Long-term care insurance is very expensive, the premiums on it. 866-893-KPECC or the AirTalk page, kpecc.org. Chris in Northridge asks, is there any consideration that Medicare might cover costs of in-home assistance? Donna Benton, USC professor, do you know if that's an additional benefit that's gotten any traction, or is the cost, again, so high that that's not gone anywhere?
Well, it's really interesting that right now there are pushes at the federal level under the new plan to look at Medicaid, home and community-based services. That's for Medicaid, and certainly there are discussions at the federal, at the local level to look at within Medicare itself, how we can expand some of the Medicare so that it could cover some of the cost within the health plans, and so that health plans would offer some of these long-term care programs.
Julie in Venice says, my mother could afford to stay in her home, but I moved her out because she was so isolated and it was affecting her mental health. Julie, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that's something that kids have to deal with their parents too, because that social interaction is so very important. Dr. Cohen, I wonder, do you have any advice if you've got a parent who is absolutely adamant that she or he wants to stay in their home, but you see they've become much more isolated as a result of that doesn't seem to have been good for their mental health. And you suspect that they would actually flourish more in some sort of a congregate living setting. How would you approach that?
So first of all, I think that just like we have in so-called senior living, many levels from independent living, assisted living, more intense nursing care, all the way to memory care, which is extremely expensive, it's intense. We should think of aging in place also with a lot of gradation. There's the independent senior who lives at home with a spouse. There's less independent people who live with children. And we need to create a gradation of services to help people stay longer at home, even when they become lonely and dependent, by bringing in nurses for a couple of hours a day, by taking them to senior daycare for a few hours to interact with other people, by creating better infrastructure of online interactions with friends, seniors, therapists, but by creating more apps that seniors can work with to enrich their lives during retirement. So I think I would support developing all these technologies and implementing them to keep people happier at home longer. But when they do need to be upgraded to one of those senior living facilities, that has to be done. And we do have excellent facilities to choose from. The problem, of course, is the cost. And long-term care is something that a very small minority of Americans have. And people solve that in various ways, but usually at costs that are prohibitive.
Yeah. In terms of people leaving their own homes, if they want to do that, the ideal is when the senior makes that choice for him or herself. In case of my great uncle, whenever my cousin would bring up the idea of him maybe moving into an assisted living environment, he just didn't want to discuss it. Conversation sort of ended. And then when he was in his early 90s, just all of a sudden he said, I'm going to move into this place. And he found a place and moved. And he was great there and finally died at the age of 99, loving the place that he had moved into. But it's funny. That's ideal, where the person just says, okay, I'm ready to make the move. And then does the research and finds the place where he or she wants to go. Let's talk with Dave in Placentia. Dave, I understand that you've been a home health care nurse. Is that right?
Yeah, I spent 10 years of my career in the UK as a district nurse, so an independent practitioner. And with imagination, you can keep virtually anybody at home, but one of the biggest problems is managing the expectations of the family. You have to be prepared to take some risk. Otherwise you disable the client by smothering them, and then they give up. So you have to give them their independence, but their independence comes with risk.
Yeah.
This is something we have to remember.
Dave, I really appreciate you sharing your personal experience. Dr. Cohen, a quick thought on what Dave's observation was in his decade of doing this work.
There's no question that Dave is correct. I think that what we need is to, again, implement technologies to deal with risk. And I think one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that there are a lot of options that we haven't utilized in terms of bringing care to the home. I think telehealth was something people really didn't take seriously until the last year, but now it's sort of routine. And that's particularly important for seniors or for regular care, even emergency care, psychotherapy. I think that the world of remote monitoring wearables, I think most people are familiar with the Apple Watch.
Yeah.
But so much of what we need to know about the health of people who are aging at home that used to require nursing care.
Yeah,
and
but now the
doctor care.
technology can help fill that gap. Dr. Pincus Cohen, Dean of the USC School of Gerontology, Professor Donna Benton, USC Gerontology School, thank you both so much. Have a great afternoon.